Okay, welcome to today's presentation with it's Understanding Discrete Trial Teaching, and it will be presented today by Michelle Antle. She is one of our field trainers here at KATC. Feel free to ask questions or make comments at any point throughout the presentation by typing your question in the question box and clicking send. If you cannot see the question box, click on the orange box with the white arrow in the upper right corner of your screen to open the question box area, and Michelle will be answering questions you submit at the end of the presentation. Michelle Antle completed her undergraduate degree at Kentucky Wesleyan College in Owensboro, Kentucky, and her Ed.S. degree in the field of school psychology. In 2011, Michelle was named Kentucky School Psychologist of the Year. She has worked as a school psychologist in public schools for 11 years and also has experience in the mental health field through serving as an autism coordinator for Family Options, Inc. and working with children and families through the Impact Plus program. In her current role at KATC, Michelle provides direct training and technical assistance to education staff, social and community personnel, counselors, job coaches, and families. And so without further ado, I will switch my screen over to today's presenter, Michelle Ansel. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
I'm switching over to you now.
Okay, great. Give me just a second to get my screen where it needs to be. So good morning and thank you all for joining us this morning. Some of the things that we're going to be talking about this morning are definitely related to discrete trial, but I need to also talk a little bit about the field of applied behavior analysis, or that theory, because so much of that theory applies directly to a discrete trial background. So we're going to be looking at definitely what the definition is and what the components of discrete trials are, as well as learning the importance that reinforcement and prompting are going to play in effective teaching using this methodology. So we also talk a lot at the center about evidence-based practices. So if you would want to know more information, you can always Google the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders, and they have a ton of information and resources that you can read about. But it's important that we use these tools and make sure that we're using these strategies that are evidence-based to make sure that we're using the sharpest tools in our toolbox, those that have shown proof that they are effective in working with individuals with autism. And so you can get more information again on that website. These are currently the 27 evidence-based practices that are listed on that webpage. And if you'll see there, the fourth bullet on the left, discrete trial teaching, is listed as one of those evidence-based practices. But discrete trial teaching is actually only one strategy that falls under the big umbrella that we call applied behavior analysis. And if you look at these 27 evidence-based practices, well over half of them actually fall under that ABA umbrella. So things like antecedent-based intervention, differential reinforcement, discrete trial teaching, extinction, functional behavioral assessment, modeling, peer-mediated intervention, some of those strategies are included. So many of these that we're going to be talking about today are actually going to be encompassing some of the other evidence-based strategies that are on the list, but again fall under that great big umbrella of applied behavior analysis. Many times when we go into schools, especially, schools will say, well, we have parents that are actually requesting ABA services for their child. And when we start asking more questions, sometimes what we realize is what those parents are actually asking for is the methodology that we know is discrete trial teaching. So I wanted to take a minute to kind of call attention to the fact that discrete trial teaching is a specific strategy, but applied behavior analysis is the larger theory or the umbrella that discrete trial teaching falls under. So when we start talking about applied behavior analysis, what exactly does that mean? It is definitely looking at a scientific approach to understanding human behavior and how that behavior is affected by the environment. So if we're to break down that definition a little more, it specifically looks at how a teacher or a parent or an individual applies behavioral principles that we understand in order to change a person's behavior. And then most importantly, the last step there is that we analyze whether the actions that we have taken results in an overall behavioral change. And so sometimes that analysis is the part that we actually forget to do. We think about what behavior principle that we're going to use, and we look to change that student's behavior, but sometimes we don't take the time to really sit back and look at the data or look at a deeper level to analyze whether what we're doing is actually resulting in that behavioral change. So that's really important. And this will be explained a little bit more as we go through more about discrete trial. So some basic assumptions of ABA that we all need to be thinking about. We all know that behavior is learned and influenced by the environment around us. At a very early age, we learn that certain behaviors are appropriate for certain situations, while other situations we know that we don't elicit those same behaviors. Like, for example, since we live in the Bible Belt, I use this example a lot with parents in trainings. We think about our behavior at church and what that needs to look like versus our behavior maybe on the playground and what that looks like. In one setting, you're with peers, but it's not okay to talk and be loud. But in another setting, you're also present with peers, but it's fine to run and jump and play and be as loud as you like because the circumstances are different. So from a very early age, we're starting to teach our children that there are appropriate times and environments where it's okay to elicit some behaviors and not in others. The other basic assumption for us to remember is that if a behavior is being maintained, meaning that we're continuing to see that behavior over and over, then obviously it's being reinforced in some way. And sometimes we forget about that. We think, well, I just want them to stop that behavior. Well, what's the function of that behavior? And today we're not going to talk a lot about functions of behaviors, but as we think more about the learning environment, we do have to be mindful of what are some things that we are doing that could be encouraging that behavior to come around. So for example, if the child is exhibiting a certain behavior in order to get the teacher's attention, then are we kind of feeding that behavior by saying, no, don't you do that, and running over to the child and maybe even verbally just reprimanding them, but ultimately it's getting what the child wants, which is that one-on-one interaction with the teacher. So the way that that's going to impact us in the learning environment is, how have we set our learning environment up? Is the way that we're presenting new educational materials or new learning materials to the child, is it kind of conducive to them being reinforced for appropriate behaviors, or maybe we're letting some things slide and then they think that that's, you know, okay to exhibit it in that particular setting. So when a behavior happens, we need to ask ourselves, what happens right before the behavior? And then what happens right after the behavior? And so we call this the ABCs of behavior. So an A stands for antecedent, the B stands for the behavior, and the C stands for the consequence. So by definition, an antecedent is anything that comes right before a behavior. A stimulus is something in the environment that triggers that behavior. So a lot of times there's a stimulus that's that antecedent that might happen. So it could be something that we hear, something that we see, something that the kid smells or tastes or touch that triggers a certain response. So antecedent, anything that comes right before. Then the behavior itself happens, and then something is always going to have to happen afterwards, which is what we're going to call the consequence. Now, the consequence, by definition, some of us think of as having a negative connotation, but a consequence in this sense is not. It's just necessarily thinking about what is happening right after that behavior. And when we think about what happens after that behavior, one of two things is going to happen. Either that behavior is going to increase and happen more often, or that behavior is going to decrease and hopefully drop off. So we say that within that consequence, we either have a reinforcing consequence or a punishing consequence. Now, when I use the word punishment, and I've put a note on your slide, in the applied behavior analysis world, the word punishment means that the behavior is less likely to happen. And oftentimes people think of punishment as something aversive, like yelling or timeout or spanking. Well, in applied behavior analysis, punishment does not mean any of those things. We're simply talking about something that is going to decrease the likelihood that a behavior is going to happen again. On the contrary, reinforcing means that we're going to hopefully increase the chance that behavior is going to happen again. So now let's get into talking about specifically what discrete trial teaching means. It really means that you're looking at a one-on-one instructional approach that we're going to use to teach skills in a planned and systematic way that is going to be highly positive and highly reinforcing, hopefully, for our student if it's set up correctly. It's characterized by very structured and repetitive types of practice so that the students are seeing the stimulus or the new concept that we're trying to teach multiple times and understand through repetition that they're able to store that information in their brain and retrieve it effectively. So discrete trial teaching also looks at those antecedents and behaviors and consequence, and we're going to break those down a little bit. So people say, well, what kind of skills or behaviors can we teach using a discrete trial training? And maybe I didn't do a great job of explaining, but discrete means a very small piece. And a trial, we'll talk a little bit more about that, is simply an antecedent and behavior and a consequence. So it could be touch purple. The kid touches the purple, and you say, great job touching purple. So that would be one trial. So training obviously is getting them through repeated practice to be able to understand the skill and repeat that skill over and over so that they can learn it better. So in terms of what kind of behaviors can we look at, we can look at teaching imitation types of behaviors, a variety of adaptive skills. So things from brushing your teeth to washing your hands to putting your pants on in the morning. It may even be learning how to use a bus system if they were to live, or a transit system if they were to live in a larger city. We also look at receptive language, which means what an individual can actually understand about a situation. And then expressive language is more about them being able to outwardly use a word to label what language it is or what they understand about their world. We can also teach them different social behaviors. Sometimes we look at teaching eye contact or carrying on conversations or not saying some things that maybe immediately come to your mind in a situation, but instead maybe filtering some of their comments. And then a variety of academics. So it can be used in a preschool setting to learn anything from colors or shapes all the way up to multiplication facts. Even some of the more repetitive types of vocabulary words that you might see in the middle and high school curriculums as well. So this is a flow chart that we kind of came up with, and I have to give kudos to several of the educational cooperatives that I work with. I partner a lot with their academic consultants, and we have put some of these training materials together. And one of the things that we found is having this visual flow chart in front of you can kind of help you understand the way a trial is supposed to be set up. So I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but at the very top you want to establish what we call attending behaviors. So that means that when you're setting up your learning environment, you want to have a very specific place. So maybe it's a table and chair, or maybe it's a specific place on the carpet where you're going to have this child located. You're going to have your materials close by, and then you're also going to have your reinforcing items, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about, close by. But you also want to make sure that we're all on the same page to knowing what we're going to teach and how we're going to teach that for our students. So the first step in doing that, in having attending behaviors, is on your behalf as the teacher and also on the behalf of the student. They need to be in a learning environment that's conducive to them paying attention, and you need to be in a learning environment that has all of those materials organized so that you can execute this effectively and swiftly and then get in there and reinforce. So the first thing that we're going to talk about after you get those attending behaviors is how you present the direction. And sometimes if you read literature, you'll see this referred to as what they call an SD, which stands for discriminative stimulus, meaning that if I were to give you a direction, if I say touch blue, that's a very different meaning than if I say give me blue. You know that between those two stimuluses, you're going to have to discriminate with what your behavior is going to respond with. So do I just simply touch it with my finger, or do I actually have to pick up maybe the flashcard and hand it to the teacher that I'm learning learning from. So knowing exactly what we call the SD is going to be is important because the vocabulary that one teacher uses needs to be the same as the vocabulary another teacher is using, at least in the very beginning. So after you present that SD or direction, you're going to wait a few seconds for the response. And some of our students, they need up to a 3-second processing time, where some of our other students may need only 1 or 1.5 seconds in order to respond. That's going to have to be individualized for your student. So after you wait, one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to go to this side and have a correct response. So if they give you that correct response, you're going to reinforce them immediately and consistently. For some of our students, that can be just as much as a high five and a great job. For other of our students, it may need to be some type of tangible reinforcement, whether that be a Smartie or a Skittle, or I've even had a couple of students work for things like crushed ice, things like that, whatever their individual preference is going to be. If that response is an incorrect response, or they don't elicit a response at all, then you're going to do what we call a correction trial, which simply means that you're going to prompt the student to get the correct response. So in the example that I gave a few minutes ago, I'm going to say, touch purple. We wait a few minutes, and the child does not respond. Then we're simply going to tap the card or guide the child's hand toward touching the purple card that might be present on the table. Then what's going to happen is that's going to start all over again. So down here we have what's called the inter-trial interval. So after they get their reinforcer, or after you prompt them to make the correct response, there's going to be a time period either where you might have to record how they responded. You could reinforce them appropriately waiting for you to get your materials ready for the next trial, or you could go ahead and set up for that next trial. So in the traditional model of discrete trial, you might go back and then present again the same stimuli. Touch purple, wait for a response. If the child responds correctly, you're going to reinforce them. Great job, that's awesome. And you're going to get your materials again together. Go back to the top again. Touch purple, wait for a response. Correct response. Great job, that's awesome touching purple. The way this might look differently if they respond incorrectly would be touch purple, wait. This is purple. You're tapping the card purple, you're guiding their arm to touch the word or the card purple, and then you go back up and start again. Touch purple, wait for a response. If it's incorrect, you prompt again. So I've kind of spelled out some of these guidelines as well, so making sure that you understand again that you establish those attending behaviors and making sure that they're sitting quietly and appropriately, whether that be hands on their lap, making sure that they're looking at you and not stimming or paying attention to some other behavior that's going on in the environment. Again, that teacher is going to deliver the SD or command. They're given so many seconds to respond, and then they're either going to get it correct or be prompted again. So I'm going to show you a video, and I hope that you all can see this. This is an example of one trial of what it might look like with a student. If you notice, our student starts out with a blank slate. Other than their reinforcers that are located in the top corner, there's nothing else on the table. This is really important when you're first starting out, because when you're presenting new material to them, you want to make sure that they're not going to confuse the concept that you're trying to teach, and that there's nothing else out on the table. And you'll notice also in a later video that I showed you, we'll show you that after you do one trial, we remove all the items from the table and then replace the items back on the table, even if we're asking for the same target or the same item. So here's an example. Touch pink. Pink. Excellent job. You get a Skittle. So in that particular example, touch pink was the directive, or the SD. The student was looking at the material. He touched the material, even named the material, and then reinforcement was given. Great touching pink. Here's a Skittle. That was his reinforcement. So that would be an example of one trial. So some of the basic principles that you need to understand before moving forward with doing discrete trial, these are some vocabulary words that you may see. One of those is stimulus control, reinforcement, errorless learning, prompting, shaping, and then what we call task analysis. So we're going to take some time to go through and see some examples or walk through some of the examples of each of these vocabulary words. Stimulus control, if you remember, is just kind of setting the stage for getting them to understand that they're supposed to respond. So if a child is under what we call stimulus control, that means that if you saw that child sitting at the table, he was sitting nicely, waiting for his instruction because he understood that reinforcement was coming if he engaged in an appropriate behavior. So for some of us, our stimulus control is going to be what we call SD, the way that we're going to deliver that instruction or that direction. So again, you want to present that in simple and concise terms. Many of our students have problems with auditory processing, meaning that they have trouble listening and organizing verbal language and how it comes into their brain. So when we're presenting them with new information, what we want to be sure that we're not flooding them with a variety of other vocabulary where they kind of have to seek and find out the words that we're trying to get across to them. So when you present an SD in simple and concise terms, you do that. So it's find circle rather than, can you find where the circle is? And sometimes if we say, can you find where the circle is, the student also has the opportunity to say no. And more importantly than what the concept is that we're teaching, within discrete trials, we're teaching a student that they have to sit and listen and then engage in a behavior in order to get their desired outcome or their reinforcement. So we don't want to give them the opportunity to say no. We want them to know that the expectation is when we're sitting in this environment and I'm trying to teach you something new, that you need to sit and listen appropriately, and I need to listen to the directions that she's going to give me. You want to make sure that you don't provide that direction unless the student is paying attention, and that you have an appropriate motivator there for them, that you know that they're wanting to work toward. Now, in early stages, I understand that sometimes getting a student, especially a younger age student, to sit at a table may not be the best place, and that's okay. Go to them in their environment, but just get something that is motivating to them so that that way you can ensure that their attention is focused on the item that you're trying to teach. Otherwise, you're just talking and your information is falling on a deaf ear. So again, and I'm going to spend some time talking about this in a minute with reinforcement, but you have to take time out to make sure that you're having reinforcing items that are present, and not things that are reinforcing to you or what you think might be a reinforcing to the child, but things that are definitely going to be reinforcing for them. You want to make sure that they're not preoccupied with other activities or objects. So again, in the video, you notice that with that student that there was nothing in his lap or nothing on the table to distract him, and there really were not a lot of other people around, at least in the very beginning of that learning situation. The next concept is reinforcement. This is obviously how we learn new skills and increase our behavior. So again, thinking about that applied behavior analysis definition of reinforcement, it's anything that's going to increase the likelihood that a behavior is going to occur. So if you think about in our real life, we go to work, we get a paycheck. So our reinforcing item is our paycheck. So that's going to increase the likelihood that we're going to go to work and actually perform our job duties as assigned. Reinforcement also establishes the relationship between the learner's behavior or their use of a skill and then a consequence of that behavior. So knowing yet again that they're going to get something good if they elicit something good or a good response. Reinforcement can also be positive or negative. And for the purposes of this webinar, we're really only going to talk about positive behavior, or I'm sorry, positive reinforcement, because we're really wanting to elicit positive behavior on behalf of that student. So again, positive meaning that we're going to give a reinforcer after the learner does something good. And in the very beginning, when you start reading about discrete trial, people think that sometimes they have to give a tangible reinforcer. And when I say tangible, that means a piece of candy, a piece of ice, you know, something that they can put their hands on. Yes, I would definitely recommend that. But for some of our higher functioning students, they are driven by social behaviors such as high fives or tickles or just any type of positive engagement with an adult at all. So just know that your reinforcement is going to differ between children, and so it doesn't always have to be a tangible reinforcement. Now, just for the purposes of understanding, I will explain to you what negative reinforcement is. And again, remembering that reinforcement serves to increase the likelihood that a behavior is going to occur. So obviously giving them something good means that that behavior hopefully will stick around, but sometimes negative reinforcement is used. And that means that we remove an object or an activity that a learner does not like or something they don't want to do when the learner does that specific skill. So let's say in the beginning that they've been tantruming and throwing a fit about doing a math problem or doing number recognition. Sometimes by simply getting them to respond one time and say, that's right, you touched the number 6, and then removing that object completely away and going to something that they might enjoy better, that could be another example of a negative reinforcement. You've removed an object that's aversive or something that they don't like to do, and so therefore they're like, okay, well that wasn't so bad. All I have to do is show her the number 6 one time, and then I get to move on. So that in and of itself can be reinforcing. There's some other examples online about negative reinforcement. I would just be cautious if you search YouTube or things like that for that kind of for those video examples. Just making sure that you see that negative reinforcement means that you're still going to increase the likelihood that the behavior is going to occur, but just by stopping that negative activity. So here's another example of positive reinforcement. And we sometimes think about when using discrete trial types of things or shaping people's behavior by using reinforcement only for kids. And this is an example of how adults might do that. This is actually from the show The Big Bang Theory. This is Sheldon Cooper, who's seated on the couch, who the producers do not acknowledge that he has a diagnosis of high-functioning autism, or what we've previously called Asperger's, but he definitely has many of the traits that people can recognize. This is his best friend, and this is his best friend's girlfriend, Penny. And Sheldon notices that Penny is coming over to their apartment quite frequently now since these two are dating because they're roommates. And he's going to try to shape Penny's behavior through the use of chocolate as a reinforcer.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Sit.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please. Oh, hey, Kim. Yeah, you know what? Hold on. Let me take this in the hall. You'll never guess who they got to replace you with.
Okay. I know what you're doing. Really?
Yes. You're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Very good. Chocolate?
So that's a funny example, but a great example of how we might use positive reinforcement in our daily lives. Obviously, that reinforcer for Penny was chocolate. So people sometimes underestimate the importance that reinforcement plays in teaching new skills. We can have the best instruction ever, but if reinforcement is not present and at the level that a student needs it to be at, then our instruction is kind of futile. We have to make sure that the reinforcers are appropriate. Would you work 12 hours and only earn a Coke in the very end? Probably not. So making sure that the work that a student has to elicit is worth the reinforcer that they're getting. So if you're giving reinforcement after every trial, if you think back to our student previously with the colors and him earning Skittles, it may be that you want to start out with maybe a half of a Skittle, like cutting them in half. Because very obviously, if you want to sit and do that for a long period of time, he's going to get pretty sick of Skittles, halfway in, and he'll be all sugared up. So making sure that your reinforcer is not only appropriate, but making sure that you kind of set that up to where that reinforcer hopefully is going to last a longer amount of time so that that motivation is going to continue to be there. You know, a little bit of a Skittle is a good thing, but sometimes too many Skittles, they're like, I really don't want any more because my stomach hurts from eating all this sugar. So making sure that you're adjusting accordingly based on the type of learning environment that you have set up. The other thing that I want to draw attention to, but we're not going to speak a lot today about, is the use of what we call preference assessments. So it could simply just be sitting down, putting several reinforcers on the table, and seeing what the student gravitates towards. Maybe it's Skittles today, maybe it's a light-up toy, maybe it's a new toy that they've never seen before and that they're curious about or interested in. I've had some kids that love things like balloons. It could be something out of the ordinary that maybe they've never seen before. Maybe a preschool student has never seen pixie sticks before, and so you can introduce them to new and exciting things and then use that as reinforcers, as well as teaching them about new things that could be around in their environment that they could get enjoyment from. So what you would want to do, and I would encourage you to do this before every teaching session, is just kind of set those reinforcers out on the table and see what the student gravitates towards. To see what it is that they need, that they may be most interested in working for, and then you can kind of prioritize your reinforcers. So it might be that at first they're really into Skittles, but after you give Skittles for so long, it's not going to be reinforcing, so what's something else that I can replace that with? And for some of the students we work with, we might sit down and do a teaching session with them in the morning, and then do another teaching session with them in the afternoon. So just knowing that what's reinforcing to them in the morning may not be reinforcing to them in the afternoon. Maybe it's that your teaching session is going to be right after lunch. So typically Skittles would be very reinforcing, but if they've just come from lunch and they have a full belly, Skittles probably are not going to be something that's appetizing to them maybe right after lunch. So just knowing that you need to have a variety of reinforcers present and analyze those reinforcers frequently and rotate them out. The other important thing that I would say, and this is one of the hardest things to do, is making sure that your student only has access to those reinforcers during the teaching sessions. Because what happens is those reinforcers lose their effectiveness. You know, I like Subway as a restaurant to go to eat for lunch, but if you brought me Subway and I could have Subway for every single meal, all of a sudden I'm not so grateful to get Subway for lunch anymore because I know that it's readily available and that I could have that at any time. So the same type of thing happens. So what I would recommend doing is making sure that if you're in a school setting that you talk with parents about what they're using at home and what their child has access to, just to make sure that, you know, things that you may be excited about using as reinforcers in the school, you know, they may not have free access to at home. And then vice versa. If you are a parent and you're having reinforcers at home, you may want to talk to the school about that or other outside providers that you work with. You know, in one of the families that I've worked with, they had an outside speech therapist that would bring dum-dum suckers with her, and it was working really great at first. And the mom said, well, I'm going to give him a dum-dum sucker every day. And all of a sudden the student stopped working for dum-dum suckers when they were working with the speech therapist, and so only after conversations did they figure out, oh, well, he's getting the suckers at other times, and so therefore we need to find another reinforcer for our therapy session to kind of move forward with. So making sure that you have good communication is really important. And also I would recommend maybe getting like a Tupperware box or some kind of Tupperware container that has like a lid with maybe a latch on it that might be difficult for your student to not open, so that way you can put the reinforcers in that box and kind of latch it shut and keep it out of reach so that the student doesn't have access to those reinforcers any other time during their day, and you can save that for your learning environment. Always make sure that you're going to give verbal praise in addition to a tangible reinforcer. So if you notice with our student previously, the teacher said, good job touching pink, here's your Skittle. So she was eliciting and explaining that good job was for touching the actual item and following through with the SD or the command or direction, but then he was also coming in contact with that tangible reinforcer. And that's important that as you start to go through and get more proficient with discrete trials, then you can kind of make your reinforcers last a little bit longer in that you might be able to say good job as reinforcement for one trial and then give the Skittle for the next trial, so kind of graduating that out. And that also teaches the child that Positive words such as great job, nice working, I love the way you're looking, all of those positive behaviors are also paired with that tangible reinforcer. So they say, when she said good looking, I also got a Skittle. So I got that Skittle for good looking, but I also got it for following through with her direction. And remember that reinforcers have to be more powerful than what the behavior gets them. Meaning that if the kid is, again, always going to have access to a Coke, then it's not going to be maybe conducive for them to utilize Coke as a reinforcer because they know that they can get that in another setting. So when we talk about reinforcement, we also need to talk about what we call schedules of reinforcement. So I mentioned a minute ago an example that as performance improves, you can systematically reduce reinforcement, meaning that you might say good job this time only, and then on the next trial give them a Skittle, and then on the next time you could say great job, the next time you could say awesome, and then on the next trial you could give them another Skittle. So what you're doing is you're systematically increasing the amount of work that you're getting for a particular reinforcer. What's really important for us all to remember is that we never should eliminate reinforcement completely. Would you go to work and not get a paycheck? Again, using that example. I might do that for a little bit, but that's probably not going to last very long because my reinforcement is important to me. I need to live. I need to get my needs met, so I need to have that check. I'm not going to work for free. So think about that with your students as well. You may figure out a system where you could gradually fade out the amount or the number of Skittles that you might be giving, but you're never going to want to take that Skittle away completely. You want to make sure that it's very planned as to how and when they're going to get that Skittle. So it's also important to know these schedules of reinforcement, to know about what to do when we're teaching new skills versus what we want to do to maintain the implementation and use of those new skills. So in the very beginning, you would see in those trials that they're going to get a Skittle for every single positive behavior. So for every trial they engage in a positive behavior, they get a Skittle every single time. That's what we call a continuous schedule of reinforcement. So you could think about this almost like a Coke machine. You put your money in, you press the button for your Coke, you elicit that behavior, and then you get your Coke. So every time you put your money in, you know that you're going to get something in return, hopefully, if the Coke machine works. That's a continuous schedule. So that's the best way that we're going to teach a new skill, to go, okay, this is how this is going to work. And then over time, we're going to move to what's called an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. So this is when that reinforcement might be given periodically. So the example I gave of maybe you're going to give them a Skittle on the first trial, and then again on the third trial, and then again on the fifth trial. So you're going to graduate them up. And then maybe it's that you're going to give them a Skittle on every third trial, and then every sixth trial, and then every ninth trial, things like that. And that's the best way that we want a student to maintain a behavior. They know that eventually they're going to get this Skittle if they keep working. They just need to keep eliciting it because they're not exactly sure when that's going to happen. And if you think about this in our daily lives, this is kind of like a slot machine. You put your money in the machine, you pull the handle, sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. But you know that if you play that machine long enough and you keep putting that money in, eventually you're going to get a big payout in the end. So it kind of works the same way. So with errorless learning, that's another concept on the behavioral list that I wanted to talk about. B.F. Skinner, who is one of the big behavioral people that you'll read about in the research, says errors are not necessary for learning to occur. So we don't have to practice something wrong or inappropriately before somebody says, nope, that's not the way to do it. So the idea behind errorless learning is to make it just that, errorless. So if you're going to teach a new skill, you're going to want to set the stage to where you prompt that child immediately. So they don't even have the opportunity to get it wrong. They don't have the opportunity to practice that skill in the wrong context. So that is also going to decrease their frustration and hopefully increase their experiences with learning, and then appropriately get them in contact with reinforcement more quickly. So they're going to be hopefully more willing to try to elicit that behavior in the future. So think about how many times that we've practiced something wrong. Like maybe we've purchased a new piece of furniture and we thought, well, we don't need to look at the manual. We'll just go ahead and try to do this on their own because we think that we understand what this is supposed to look like. And then we bomb. And then we have to go back and we think, gosh, wouldn't it have just been easier for me in the beginning to have read the manual to begin with, and so that way I didn't have to take this entire piece of furniture apart when I had gotten all the way to the end. It's kind of the same thing. A manual in that sense would be kind of like errorless learning. We're setting the stage to where we're not going to make a mistake. Hopefully the expectations are going to be clear-cut in the beginning so that we don't practice the wrong response. Because once we practice a wrong response, we're going to have to work doubly as hard in order to learn a different response for that behavior. It's also by giving them the correct answer or prompting them through the correct answer, it's also going to hopefully reduce the chances of a behavioral outburst. We know that learning can be very frustrating for many of our students. Learning can be frustrating for us. So anything that we can do to increase the likelihood of a positive learning experience, we should do that. And that's what errorless learning does, is it keeps the focus on the positive. So I'm going to show you a video, and this is again our same student. And in the video, the student is learning about shapes. And the teacher has realized that this particular student doesn't know either of the shapes that are going to be presented here. So she's going to place both of them down, and before the cards down, and before giving the student an opportunity to fail, she's going to point to the right answer so that he can come in contact with reinforcement.
Touch rectangle. Great, touching rectangle. Look at a smarty. Hey, show me good sitting. Hands in your lap. Great job. Touch rectangle. Excellent job.
So as you see in our example, he actually even looked toward the star at the second trial, but the teacher immediately prompted rectangle so that he could immediately get contact with that reinforcement. And if you notice here too, as he leaned over on the table, she stopped to prompt to establish those attending behaviors to make sure that he was seated appropriately and that his hands were in his lap. And he even utilized that word as well. So another definition we talked about is prompting. And by definition, this just means any help that we're going to give to our learners that's going to assist them in a specific skill. That can be a verbal answer, it could be gesturing toward the correct object, just like I did in that last video, or maybe even physical assistance to show a learner how or what is expected of them. It's generally given by an adult or maybe a peer, so that way that learner can attempt to use that new skill. Prompting procedures are considered foundational to the use of many other evidence-based practices. So those 27 evidence-based practices that were listed, many of them require prompting as another skill that needs to be implemented. So there's different types of prompts, and there's many, but these are just a few that are the most common. We want to start up here with a full physical prompt. Maybe in this particular example of the student in the video, maybe he didn't reach for either of the shapes. So it might be that the teacher would reach for his hand and physically take his hand and put it onto the rectangle so that way he could know that that was the answer that needed to be given. A partial physical prompt could be that maybe the student didn't make a general move for the correct answer, so you might maybe guide their elbow or maybe just barely touch their wrist or tap them on the shoulder to encourage them to make a response period. That would be a partial physical prompt. Modeling is often used when maybe we're teaching maybe an imitative behavior. So let's say that we want to teach a student to clap their hands. So it might be that we say clap and they don't elicit that behavior, so we actually model clapping, clap our hands, and then the student is going to clap in response. So maybe we can use imitation in that form as a prompt. A positional prompt could be used in a situation maybe where, again, there would be flashcards on a table involved. So what you would do is simply position the response that you're wanting them to give nearest the student. So it may be that in that last example, star could be more toward the top of the table where the reinforcer was located, and the rectangle could be right in front of the student, so the student knows that that is the target that we want them to touch. A gestural prompt was what was modeled in the video, so a simple tap on the table or touching the item that we want the individual to select. And then a verbal prompt. A verbal prompt was also kind of used in that video, in that we say, oh, where do our hands need to be? And I said, in your, and the student said, lap. So we said lap together. That would be an example of a verbal prompt. You could also do this when teaching personal information, like, what's your name? Houston. So you give them the answer, and they simply have to copy the answer from you. These are what we call the most intrusive prompts here at the top, and then you work your way down the continuum to what we call the least intrusive prompt, for most of our students anyway. So it could be that up here, if this is a most intrusive prompt, means that the most amount of effort is required on the behalf of the teacher, and the least amount of effort is required of the student. So obviously you want to fade the level of prompts, and you want to move down this continuum very quickly, so that that way they don't become dependent on you getting their physically grabbing their hand and touching the item it is that they're wanting. For some of our students, they become most dependent, however, on verbal prompts. They're always going to wait for you to give them the answer, and they're not going to try that on their own. So consider maybe doing a partial verbal prompt. So for example, in the video, where do you put your hands? In your, and then you wait for the student to fill in the blank, in your lap, so that they understand. So the important thing about prompting is that you understand that you need to fade those prompts. A task is not considered to be learned unless the student can complete that skill without any type of prompt at all. And that's common to what's expected in their natural environment. They're not always going to have a teacher following them around to explain to other people in their environment, oh, he actually means this when he gives this response. So he needs to be able to do this skill with a variety of people. So making sure that you fade those prompts so that they don't become dependent on either the person or the prompt that that person is actually giving. And making sure that you fade that prompt even within a session as quickly as possible. Provide only as much help as that student needs. So it might be that if you go back to this continuum, then in the very first trial, you use a full physical prompt. And in the second trial, you move to a partial physical prompt. And if the student doesn't elicit a successful response with a partial physical, then you just simply move back up to the full physical. But the most important thing is, as a teacher, and when I say a teacher, I also mean parent, another therapist that works with your child. A teacher is anything that a teacher in my book is anybody that is teaching that individual a new skill. So just making sure that we're constantly aware of what level that we are at in the realm of physical prompting, and then moving our way down the continuum. The other vocabulary word that we talked about is shaping. And this just means that in the very beginning, if you think about normal development, when a toddler starts to talk, they don't immediately walk up to you one day and say, bottle. They are probably going to start by pointing and looking at you to see, how you're going to respond, and then you're going to give it to them. And then you might model the word for them, say bottle. And they might look at you, and the next time they might come up to you and say, ba? And you go, yes, that's right. So we reinforce them for being able to use any type of verbal language at all, and then we're going to shape that response up. So it might go from ba to bata to bottle, and then we eventually get to the word bottle, like you and I would say it. So that would be one example of how you might shape a behavior using verbal utterances. Another way we might shape a behavior is what we call by using desensitization training. So it might be by, let's say that you have a child that is fearful of dogs, and not that you might do this in your home, but this would be an example. That student may not be able to be physically even near a dog or hear a dog barking. So it might be that you start and you show them a physical dog is not around them in any shape or form, and it might just be that you show them a picture of a dog. And if they respond calmly, then you praise them and tell them what a good job that it is, that it's just a dog, and then you make that go away. And then eventually you might want to pair a picture with maybe a sound of a dog in the background so that they have to get used to that. And as they get tolerant of that, then you praise and shape their behavior for that. And then you can generally work up toward or gradually work up toward maybe having a dog appear in their backyard when they're on the inside with a glass pane paned window in between them. So those would be baby steps. And so I kind of think about shaping as taking baby steps. So you're going to start small in what you expect them to do, and then we'll shape that behavior into something that you would typically want to see, what is desirable for that individual. And the last word that we want to talk about is what we call task analysis. A task analysis is breaking a larger behavior into smaller components. And what you want to do is you want to teach those smaller components as a discrete step. So it might be that, let's say that you want to teach a child, the bigger skill would be to teach a child how to brush their teeth. Well, one of the first discrete skills then that you may want to teach is, this is a toothbrush. So you might put a toothbrush on the table and say, touch toothbrush. That would be the very beginning of teaching a very discrete skill. The next skill might be that you would want to teach, the next discrete skill in that analysis might be that you want to teach what a toothbrush does. So you might put a toothbrush and a pair of scissors on the table and say, or a pencil on the table, that might be safer, and say, which of these do you brush your teeth with? So that they understand the function of that item. So that might be the second step that you would teach. So again, you're going to reinforce and prompt each of those discrete skills, and then you can chain all of those together to know that, okay, this is the toothbrush, it's used for brushing my teeth, then I need to put toothpaste on the toothbrush and water on the toothbrush, and then I put the toothbrush in my mouth and move it back and forth like this, and that's called brushing my teeth. So that's what we would call a task analysis, taking a larger skill that you want to teach, breaking it down into the smaller components, and then teaching each of those components independently, and then you could chain them together after they are what we call mastered. So they become more independent. So again, this might be a visual representation of a task analysis. Overall, this is how you brush your teeth. You put toothpaste on the toothbrush, you brush your teeth, you brush the top teeth first, the bottom teeth next, you rinse, and then you wipe your face. Another task analysis for washing your hands. Again, it's just simply breaking that independent skill that you wish them to learn down into smaller parts. And you see these frequently now even in public restrooms, especially in restaurants, from health departments that are trying to promote good, healthy hand washing and hygiene. So you're probably saying to yourself, with 10 minutes left of this training, so how can I use this with my particular child? The first thing that you need to think about is, what are some things, what is it that I want to teach? What are some things that are going to be reinforcing? How do I want to start this out? What are some things that are most important to us at this point? So by doing that, you need some key terminology. In your handouts, it's probably blank, but I wanted to give you the definitions as well. So one of the things is, and you've heard me use this word, target. The target is, what specifically is it that we're wanting to teach that student? So it may be rectangle, that the shape that we're trying to teach, or pink would be a color, or maybe toothbrush is an item that we're wanting to teach. So that's what we call a target. Then we also have what's called a distractor. A distractor is anything that the child doesn't know or hasn't been formally taught. So something that's going to distract their attention away from getting the correct response. So as you saw with the shapes in our student Houston, he had a star and a rectangle. So the star was also a distractor. The teacher knew that he had not been exposed to, nor did he know what a star was, and also not knowing what a rectangle was. So in that particular example, the rectangle was the target and the star was the distractor. Now, if that particular teaching of shapes had been a true learning setting, what I might want to do is, after presenting the rectangle with the star several times, again, rectangle being the target and the star being the distractor, I might want to rotate out those distractors. So let's just say that he also doesn't know what a heart is, or that he also doesn't know what a triangle is. I might want to pair that rectangle at first maybe with the star, and then pair the rectangle with the heart, and then pair the rectangle with the triangle, so that way that the individual doesn't start learning that a rectangle is simply not a star. So you want to rotate those distractors out and keep a pile of those readily available, so that way you can practice with those in your trial as well. So in this particular example, I want you to look at what are some of the targets that you see and what are the distractors that are present.
Touch yellow. Good job.
So in that particular example, the target was yellow and the distractor was blue. So again, you saw her present the stimuli. He responded and he got
Good job.
a reinforcer.
Touch yellow. Good job.
So again, that was one trial. Touch yellow was the SD or command. He responded by touching the correct item, and then he received a Smartie as a reinforcer. And one of the other reasons that I wanted to use this example is this little girl in the picture is 7 years old. She's seen Discrete Trial modeled with this little boy several times, and so she immediately started picking up on that this is what I'm supposed to do. This could also be used in your classroom if you are a teacher. If you have one of your what I call mother hen students, which is like this little girl who wants to do well and she wants to play teacher and play boss, she could be a really good teacher for the student. So while you're working with other individuals, you might be able to, once you get them kind of familiar with the way a discrete trial is set up, maybe it would be good to have a peer work with them just so that they get to get used to working with someone else. The other point that I like to make with this is if you can teach a 7-year-old to do discrete trial and to do it effectively, then I think there's no excuse that adults can't do it as well. It just requires some modeling and prompting of that student and guidance, and also reinforcing her for helping the student to learn his colors and to engage in appropriate behaviors by sitting at the table as well. So another question that we frequently get is, well, what do I teach and where do I start? A lot of information that I gain on discrete trial is just through my own personal experiences. So I personally like to start with teaching imitation behaviors. And if you think back to development, that's how a lot of kids learn new behaviors in their environment, by watching and copying other people. So sometimes we have to formally teach our students how to copy that other behavior. So it may be that you teach them, do this, and you clap your hands twice, and then you expect them to imitate that behavior. So then they understand that, oh, I'm supposed to watch other people and do what they do, specifically maybe even in a social setting. So I like to start with imitation, and then maybe move on to things like receptive language. So that way, if the child especially is nonverbal, they're able to point to objects and show me what knowledge that they actually have, that they do have knowledge of vocabulary. Like in that picture, the little boy knows what the color yellow is, so he's able to demonstrate that skill. Now there's another resource that I like, and it's called Behavioral Intervention for Young Children with Autism. It was put out several years ago, about in the mid-1990s. And the book is by Catherine Maurice. And within that book, it's a very good framework, in my opinion, for parents and professionals on knowing where to start. There are some curriculum guidelines that are in there to say maybe if you have an early learner, maybe you want to start with, just getting them to sit and understand that that's appropriate, and then moving on to imitation skills, and then maybe teaching some other things like colors and other early language types of skills. There's what they call kind of like an intermediate learner profile of some things that you might want to teach what you consider to be an intermediate learner, and then more of your advanced learners. It kind of gives you a curriculum, or maybe not specifically the items to teach, but maybe the skills to teach. So again, on those advanced learners, they don't need to spend time with imitation. They've already mastered that. So maybe we need to jump immediately to academics types of skills, like knowing that this is a number and this is a letter, and then maybe adding two numbers together to get a sum, and teaching them that vocabulary. So there's some different ideas and curriculums and guidelines, and it spells out things in there. It also has charts that you can print out and do I dare say copy for educational purposes, of course, that you can record your own child's progress and targets that you're going to work for. You could even list at the bottom of a page maybe a list of distractors, and it has on there terminology like SD, or the target, that discriminative stimulus that we talked about. So touch blank, and then you can have your list of targets, so that way that a variety of individuals that are working with your child are going to know what to do. You also heard me hear the word, say the word mastery, and you say, well, what does mastered mean? Mastered means that if I were to put those two colors out there, that Houston would be able to touch yellow 80% of the time or greater out of all the trials that I ask him to elicit or ask him to perform. And the reason why that is important is because if you have a student that can get that at about 80%, then that's without prompting at all. Then that's sending you the message and giving you the data to support that they're learning that particular skill. And to take that a step further, I would recommend that also you introduce a second person into that particular, on that particular trial or those particular trials and that particular target to make sure that that student is learning it both with me and then maybe learning it with the other little girl that was in the picture. So making sure that he's generalizing over from one person to another and from one day to the next. So you also might want to consider doing that over 2 environments. So if they elicited at 80% at school with the teacher and then also do that 80% at home with their parent, then you can pretty much make the assumption your data is going to guide you to say that they have mastered that skill and it would be safe to move on to a different color or a different shape. When you're introducing new types of things, it might be helpful to have a good ratio of things that are mastered, so things that they're already really, really good at versus things that are new. So if you look at some of the research, it supports that you might want to have a 60 to 40% ratio, meaning that 60% of mastered tasks are present within that teaching environment and 40% of those are going to be new types of things. That keeps the flow of things going really well and building what we call behavioral momentum. If you begin sessions or include in sessions objectives that are easier or that the student already knows, then they're going to feel success with that and think, I can do this, and then maybe elicit a little bit more effort on learning some of those things that are more difficult for them. For some of our kids, the faster that you move with discrete trials, the better. And so the bigger the percentage, of course, then that you can get of mastered, new task to mastered task. You might be able to move to maybe like a 50-50% ratio and then eventually swap it around and have 60% new and 40% mastered. The important thing is to look at your data and let your data guide. Make sure also that you're incorporating these objectives into as many activities as possible in their natural environment. If they're able to go to preschool and the teacher says, what color is this? And little Houston raises his hand and says, yellow, and you're like, wow, he really did learn that yellow. So he's exhibiting that skill that they're mastering in that discrete trial teaching type of setting over into a natural environment. And a lot of times that's what we forget. We think, well, gosh, if we use discrete trial teaching, does that mean that we're always going to have to teach them using that methodology and that they're never going to learn in another environment or in the ways that we might see other students learning in the environment? And the answer is no. But a discrete trial, again, is just a discrete step in getting them to learning to pick up on things in their natural environment and not have to be taught every single skill in that discrete trial teaching type of format. You'll also see in the research things that we call MASH trials versus verbal behavior types of things. MASH trials are, and I'm giving you just kind of tidbits of this because this is a question that we get a lot of, is more of where you're going to have 10 repetitive trials in a row on one skill. So again, it would be touch yellow, touch yellow, touch yellow, touch yellow, 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 yellow for 10 trials in a row without introducing any other shapes or any other different type of color. And for some students that's effective because they need that high amount of repetition with that same word over and over and over again. With more verbal behavior methodologies, it may be that that's pairing teaching with rewards and they mix and vary skills. So it could be touch yellow, that's great touching yellow, touch your nose, oh great touching your nose, excellent job, here's your reinforcer. All right, touch yellow, we're going to go back to that. Find the square and they have to touch the square and then you come back, touch yellow. So they mix and vary the types of skills that they're working on. So you can read a little bit more about that, but one is not better than the other. Again, it just has to be completely individualized for a student, for that student. Both methods are effective. I've used both type of methods with a variety of individuals that I've worked with over my career, and it just depends on the student. You know, they both use the prompting sequence. They both use errorless learning and encourage the use of that. They also use reinforcers and then focus on the importance of fading out those prompts and rewards. And they both focus on problem solving and task analysis. So what's the larger skills that we're trying to teach, and then teaching those skills in discrete parts. There's also the data collection part, and I would encourage you that if you, those of you watching this webinar, if you have specific questions about data collection, that might be more of an individualized type of question that you could email me at the center and we could talk more about, or we could even have a phone conversation about. But data is collected in different ways. For some of our students, it's trial by trial collection. That means that you put the two colors out and you say touch yellow, great job touching yellow. So you might record a plus. And you go back again, touch yellow, great job touching yellow. You record a plus. So that's what we call trial by trial collection. And that's good because it provides us a lot of data, and it ensures that we're doing a sufficient amount of trials and that we're following the definition of a trial, quote unquote, that ABC appropriately. But it also is very time consuming, and the student can get bored because it can kind of be slow sometimes. So you may have to use this with some of their students because of their way that their program has to be structured, or the way that they're responding, or the way that their reinforcement system is working for them currently. You can eventually move to, or for some students even start with, what we call probe data, which means that you can literally sit down and just try one of everything. So it might be you sit down and you say, touch yellow, great job touching yellow. Touch the square, great job touching square. Find your nose, great, you found your nose. So you do one trial of all of the specific targets that you're looking to measure, and you just record on that one trial. And then you get through all of it, and then you're not worried about your data so much. This is more effective for students that are more advanced, and even staff that are more advanced once they get comfortable with what the discrete trial format looks like. It's less paperwork, and you can fit more instructional time into your day. But it definitely does not give you the information about their learning curves. And so sometimes it may show that they're not making progress because there's not a lot of detailed information. So I would just encourage you to do what works for you, and it may be experimentation. And again, I would be happy to help any of you with that particular aspect. But data collection is super important because that data collection is going to guide what we're doing. It's either going to tell us, hey, this student is not understanding what it is that I'm asking him to do, and I need to stop and back up. Or the vice versa of that is, wow, the student is really plugging through really quickly, and maybe I need to adjust my pace and move at a little quicker pace. So just make sure whatever method you try is doable for you and the people that are working with the student. There's some helpful websites that I've given there. The Autism Internet Modules is a free resource that I strongly encourage you to utilize. You just sign up for that for free and create a user ID and password, and they also have some very specific videos there present so you can learn more about discrete trials in addition to this webinar. There's also some references there, so feel free to look at some of those. Does anyone have any questions? I'm not seeing any questions in the question box, so I would just remind you that if you have a question, feel free to type the question and I will respond with an answer.
Okay. So I don't see any questions either. Oh, wait a minute. Is there a way to access the webinar later? Yes, the webinar will be put up later on to be viewed on our website. So yes, you will be able to watch it again later. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, thank you. Thanks, Michelle, for giving us such a helpful website today with so much information. And
Absolutely.
And I'd like to thank everybody else for attending today as well. And if any of you are interested in watching any other webinars, we have over 70 free webinars on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and type in KY Autism Training, you'll be able to access any of those webinars. So this concludes today's presentation, and I'd like to thank everyone for watching, and have a good day.